And what I propose to do is introduce the three speakers, and then we'll ask each of them to speak in order, starting with Zoha Waseem from King's College London, and by way of Karachi, Pakistan, her hometown, has written a paper called Legitimacy and the Dual Policing Mechanisms in a Securitized City, examining the roles and practices of the police and paramilitary forces in Karachi, Pakistan. So we'll let Zoha speak first for 15 or 20 minutes, and then if Uday shows up, he'll actually get a turn. If he doesn't, well, we will dock his pay. And then Uday Chandra from GUQ, he's a member of our faculty, will speak on illiberal politics of going native, making tribes in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And then finally, we'll have one of our own graduates. Oh, Uday, come up. This is Uday Chandra. He actually exists, and he's even got a piece of paper with him, so this is a good sign. It means he's going to have something to say. Uday, I was just explaining that I'm going to introduce the three of you, and then we're just going to go down the row, and you can either speak from your seat or come to the podium as you prefer. Finally, one of our own graduates, who's now a PhD candidate at Qatar University in Durham in a dual degree program, and meanwhile is working with Miran Kamrava and his colleagues in the Center for International and Regional Studies. So we're getting a lot of service out of this young man. Has written a paper on the ruling family, security, and national identity in Qatar, and he'll be speaking on that in third. So what we'll do is we'll just go down the row and listen to each of our speakers. Then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for your questions or comments, and also for them to compliment one another on the brilliance of their papers. So Zoha, do you want to start for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So my paper is basically part of a larger research project that's trying to understand policing in the city of Karachi. When the project started, I was interested in studying and understanding how the culture of policing is shaped by political, social, and economic structures and the relationship between these structures in urban areas. And part of it was trying to understand what sort of everyday challenges do police officers have to face during their engagements with the city. When I initially started my fieldwork, the idea was to focus exclusively on the Karachi police to see how the state operates through the police. But as the fieldwork progressed, I realized that it would be an incomplete project if I excluded the role of the paramilitary from a study on policing in Karachi, and if I did not try to examine how a paramilitary force can challenge a civilian force in urban areas. It began appearing to me just how ingrained and how embedded the paramilitary had become in the urban social fabric, the vocabulary and the thinking of civilians in the city. And that led me to think more about the militarization of cities and the militarization and paramilitarization of policing in urban areas like Karachi and how they might be becoming a new norm. So the discussion presented here needs to be understood while taking into account geopolitical factors as well. With the increase in transnational crime and terrorism and the nexus between the two, as well as dependence upon armed forces to curtail urban rebellion and protect cities and volatile regions, in the post-Cold War era, the distance between internal security and external security is fast blurring. Moreover, because of the way security-centric narratives are framed, individual security is often confused or conflated with national security. As a result, the gap between the military and the police has been reducing as well, contrary to the framework of the modern nation state, with increasing reliance upon gendarmeries and paramilitary forces. So studying the relationship between the police and paramilitary as well as the conduct of the two is thus relevant to these internal-external security connections and the global discourses of defense and security that are constantly shaping how we think about law and order and how public consent is shaped to provide legitimacy to new forms of policing. It has been argued in my paper that policing in weak states, such as Pakistan, must be studied. No, sorry, not in my paper, but it has been argued generally that policing in weak states such as Pakistan must be studied with a grey level analysis, which calls for a more nuanced approach towards policing and state power. One scholar wrote that not all policing institutions are made equal, either in strength or in their principle. Objectives, understanding, as well as judgments of police actions must display an appreciation of the challenges of living and working in the society in question. However, this does not negate the importance of critically assessing how institutions police a given society with increasingly overlapping mandates between institutions. A critical approach does not cast aside shades of gray. It takes into account the challenges of policing, but it questions the policies and methods that may in fact be counterproductive for the governance of security in a setting. Moreover, a critical analysis can tell us how policing is often not just about crime control, but also about shaping public opinion, managing politics, and organizing the political economy of a society. Or as Brodeur differentiated, it is about high-level political policing and low-level criminal policing. So the dual policing mechanism at work in Karachi operates between these two levels, protecting civilian and military state interests, and in doing so, the mechanism has become more and more cloaked in secrecy and infringing upon civil rights. Studying the dynamics, studying the dual policing model in a place like Karachi does not only reveal what sort of urban chaos is being generated by groups challenging the state and the status quo. Studying the dynamics between a civil police force, which is the provincial subject, and the paramilitary force, which is a federal subject, in a given setting, it also reveals how the structural relationship between state institutions, military and civil, in Pakistan determine how the center and periphery use these security forces to keep a hold over urban areas and the urban populace. It also reveals how these forces can be used for accumulating wealth and economic resources and acquiring political support. Essentially, in the case of Karachi, the dual policing mechanism also tells us how the center and periphery negotiate amongst each other for control over the city by relying on forces that have been tasked with policing. The dual policing mechanism thus divides policing and security governance. Neither the police nor the military nor the paramilitary can be said to have monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Both rely upon limited or provisional authority and provisional legitimacy. So the first thing I have attempted to do in my paper is to explain how the dual policing mechanism came about. Post-partition with India, Karachi witnessed a surge in its population and a shift in demographics. The city police was understaffed, ill-equipped, and lacking in basic infrastructure such as police stations. Each decade since partition brought significant changes in Karachi, either in terms of migration, labor movements, student movements, ethnic violence, religious violence, or militancy. Multiple stakeholders emerged in the city that hoped to cash in on the city's economy and would routinely threaten the state or be used by the state. And because of bureaucratic and political influences, the city police and the police in Pakistan remained unreformed. Any measures to reform policing failed miserably. The one effort that was undertaken to reform the police was in 2002, but that too became a victim of political compromise and was amended by the Musharraf regime to appease provincial governments who wanted to retain provincial control over the state police forces. And eventually in Sindh and Balochistan, the 2002 police order was repealed, and both provinces they reverted back to the 1861 Police Act from British India, under which the police was modeled along the lines of the Irish constabulary. So colonial laws and legislation continued to apply. In the 80s and 90s then, Karachi police gradually began losing legitimacy, while simultaneously trying to restore their power by acting extra-legally. In the words of Egon Bittner, who wrote about the functions of police in a modern society, the extra-legal power to intervene with coercive force is the main reason why the police are ambivalently feared and admired. A social status suggesting that the legitimacy is always already questionable at best. The 80s and 90s saw reports about police abuse, such as the infamous encounter killings, lack of training, lack of professionalism, and political interferences into the inner workings of the Karachi police. It was essentially the 80s that set the tone for the entrance of the paramilitary force on the security landscape of Karachi and Sindh. Instead of improving the existing policing structures and ridding it of its colonial baggage, the state continued to rely upon and continues to rely upon military and paramilitary support for controlling disorder in Karachi and filling the security gap. So, one scholar has written on policing in Pakistan that even in the absence of a permanent state of emergency, the militarization of the police and policing and the reliance of the police on military personnel and resources indicate that civilian policing plays a subordinate role in security governance. So while the military regimes of Ayub Khan, Ziaul Haq, and Musharraf, they tried to establish greater footholds in Karachi by indirectly or directly supporting certain groups and actors within the city, over the last 3 decades, this effort has become more direct with the penetration of a paramilitary force, the Sindh Rangers, into the city's urban landscape. But getting access to the Sindh Rangers is certainly not comparable to the access one has to the civilian police force. The Sindh Rangers is a paramilitary force that, through the corps commander, as well as gazetted officers seconded from the army, is a lot more secretive and guarded. There's very little written about the inner culture and the workings of the institution of the Sindh Rangers. They are not easily approachable. They often don't reveal their last names. When they sit in on high-level meetings or when they are conducting raids or disseminating press releases, their names may often be withheld. This is not the case with the Karachi police. There's also a certain imbalance in terms of the information both institutions share with each other. This asymmetry of information between the Karachi police and Sindh Rangers and how this keeps both forces in a constant state of negotiation for power, control, and legitimacy when it comes to policing Karachi got me more interested in understanding how a dual policing mechanism has developed and how it affects the politics of policing. So the Pakistan Rangers officially, although they're part of the Ministry of Interior, but they can be described as a hybrid force as they have an intermediary status between the police and the military. But they remain institutionally close to the latter, both in terms of their structure, hierarchy, training, and culture. They have been deployed since 1989, but they assisted the army in the 1992 operation against the MQM, which represents the Muhajir ethnic group in Karachi. They have since been stationed in the city, and since 2009, they have been given policing powers by the provincial government. In the early 1990s, reports of disputes between the police and paramilitary began emerging. These disputes often trickled down to junior-level officers, and in the mid-1990s, there were reports about the police registering cases against the Sindh Rangers for acting outside the law. In the 1995 operation against the MQM, the police were assisted by the Rangers, but tensions remained high between the two. While it was officially a police-led operation, it would be incorrect to assume that the Rangers were acting on the orders of the civilian counterparts. By now, the Rangers had been granted policing powers to arrest, interrogate, and prosecute through an amendment in the Criminal Procedure Code. This stirred a debate within the legal community, with a renowned constitutional lawyer claiming that such a legal cover undermined provincial autonomy. The 1997 Anti-Terrorism Act expanded the powers of the law enforcement personnel. As part of the securitization processes and policies the state adopted for application in Karachi, the ATA was described as an extraordinary measure to deal with an extraordinary situation. The ATA thus essentially legalized excessive use of force by both the police and paramilitary personnel, including extrajudicial killings. Since 2013, both forces, the police and the paramilitary, have been given a free hand. The ongoing Karachi operation officially began in September 2013, and the Director General of Sindh Rangers, a Major General, has become its de facto operational commander. So both the Karachi police and Sindh Rangers continually strive to gain public consent over time by demonstrating measurable successes, often through numbers and data that cannot be independently verified. And both forces continually contest for popular legitimacy by projecting themselves as the rightful saviors of the city, the most legitimate means of policing its population. Officially, they tend to repeat the state narrative that the paramilitary is there to assist the police and that both forces have good cooperation. In reality, the relationship is need-based and fraught with mistrust and competition. The following views from interviews with the police and paramilitary can give an indication of how disturbed this relationship is, and both sides continuously keep accusing each other of engaging in a sort of badmashi, like hooligans or troublemakers, basically. Speaking on the Rangers, a Deputy Inspector General, DIG, from Karachi Police opined that the Rangers get away with illegitimate practices through the construction of security narratives. They thrive on de facto legitimacy. Another police officer went on to criticize those policemen who collaborate with the Rangers. Some cops like the Rangers, and he says, some cops like the Rangers because of the work the Rangers have done against the MQM. For some cops, it's personal. The Rangers arrest MQM militants who were responsible for killing cops. On paper, the Rangers are there to assist the police, but off the record, they operate independently with autonomy as the political arm of the army. On their part, the paramilitary officers do indicate a level of mistrust that they hold for the police. during an interview, a ranges officer said to me, information sharing with the police and police stations is kept to a minimum. Information sharing happens during specific cases. The police need the confidence to act independently. And then he went on saying that I try and praise the police in front of my juniors to get them to respect their civilian counterparts. They laugh at me and say, sir, are you joking? It's because of this lack of trust that the military and paramilitary has in the police, which is not entirely unfounded. The Rangers requested for their own police stations and have requested for permanent policing powers as well. Essentially, they are requesting for a completely parallel system of policing that would fall under the army against that which falls under the civilian government. So in attempts to establish an image of a strong Pakistani state in the face of growing international criticism for being unable to counter terrorism, Pakistani state structures create legal measures complemented by security narratives that prevent the state as being viewed as a fierce state. In the process, the state remains weak and its legitimacy low, allowing more room for discretion for security personnel because of a greater level of concern for domestically generated threats to the security of the government. In such a condition, the state has continued to rely heavily upon military guardianship and put security and defense above all else, not realizing the impermanence of the militarization of security. This kind of prioritization has rubbed off on domestic fronts vis-à-vis the forces responsible for policing, further militarizing and paramilitarizing the task of policing. Agamben's permanent state of exception within or outside the law, combined with the doctrine of necessity to take exceptional measures in exceptional circumstances, can be used to explain how the paramilitary's presence and military's involvement in Pakistan's domestic affairs and internal conflicts has been legitimized and allowed security forces to rely on de facto legitimacy. The doctrine of necessity, which was made popular in the 1950s, has been applied routinely through security narratives and discourses of security personnel and statesmen and by their civil and military patrons in Pakistan to necessitate and legitimate certain practices in Karachi. The existing policing mechanism is unlikely to witness a complete, long-lasting overhaul that can appease all stakeholders. At best, the dual policing mechanism can gradually legitimize multiple nodes of control in Karachi, allowing them to negotiate with one another for power while eliminating any one particular player's chances of monopolizing the legitimate use of force, and without disturbing the peace to an extent that disrupts the status quo to the point of collapse. In doing so, both institutions will keep internalizing the fact that they must do what it takes to remain relevant, including getting their hands dirty, as their authority and to an extent, and by extension, their legitimacy is provisional upon the contexts and conditions in which they operate and the competition that they have to face from each other. With the intention of monopolizing power, a state often becomes an active player behind the deterioration of law and order in urban areas, thus constantly remaining in a state of negotiation with other stakeholders for legitimacy. The trouble with this approach is that the problem of governance tends to remain unresolved. Until it does, the impermanence of order is the only certainty to speak of. In the end, it's worth remembering that legitimacy is a constructed concept, not fixed in time or space. The police and paramilitary have to continue evolving their impermanent states of being. Just as the state of affairs in Karachi is always in a state of flux, similarly, law and order in urban areas and megacities are bound to remain in a state of flux. Police and paramilitary violence and their everyday behavior in general demonstrate an evolutionary process. Legitimacy associated with policing is going to fluctuate indefinitely. And the legitimacy of the Sindh Rangers is thus bound to fluctuate time and again as well. Therefore, I would argue that the city remains at risk for further violent conflict, and impermanence of order is the only certainty. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoha.
My paper is really trying to think through this idea of tribe that you see all across the Indian Ocean world, from South Asia and the Middle East, especially the Gulf, and various parts of Africa. I'm trying to also try methodologically to take an approach which makes us look outside of the Indian Ocean region for where this notion of tribe actually comes from, and then try to connect it with where we are physically. Now, the origins of the word tribe, or tribus in Latin, are rather remote. Titus Livy, the ancient Roman historian, tells us that tribus refers to a three-way or tripartite arrangement by which the people of central Italy came to be divided in the early history of Rome. The Indo-European prefix "tri" gives away this particular root, this emphasis on the tripartite arrangements, but there was no ethnic implications of being part of a tribe. Livy says that Rome's mythical founder, Romulus, literally divided the people into tribes, which contributed arms and men to the republic and to the Comitia Tributa, which is kind of the assembly of tribes. By the late 3rd century, the number of tribes had grown from 3 to 35, some of which were urban and some of which were rural. From the very beginning, it appears that tribes were made by executive order, as it were, and they were essential to the governance of the polity. With the expansion of Rome, it encountered new peoples whom Romans called barbarians, following standard Greek usage for foreigners speaking exotic tongues, which kind of sounded to them like just barbar. The barbarians, too, were organized into tribes within the empire, irrespective of their ethnicity or history, and they could also become Romans over time. The underlying assumption following Roman precedent was that everyone was ethnically mixed, no one was pure, as could be readily inferred from the infamous tale of the rape of the Sabine women under Romulus's watch. That Roman emperors came from across the Mediterranean world and that citizenship extended to all subjects by 212 CE point to a fairly uncontroversial fact. Being Roman was not a matter of ethnicity, race, or blood in the manner that modern empire builders and their post-colonial successors would understand this word. The inheritance of Rome in late antiquity and the Middle Ages ensured that the notion of tribe did not die out in the areas that constituted the Roman Empire, whether in Northern Europe or across the Mediterranean world. The tribe would simply take on new post-imperial afterlives. The polyglot hybrid populations of the Roman Empire would decenter themselves into new polities, whether in Germania or Arabia, but equally as the Byzantine, Umayyad, and Carolingian state-building projects suggest, they would also seek, successfully or not, to reclaim the universal empire of Rome. Medieval empires were as notoriously mixed and hybrid to modern eyes as their Roman predecessor. Much of the mixing, especially at the top of society, came from the gendered strategies pursued by households or families to enhance their power vis-a-vis others via matrimonial alliances. The competitive pursuit of power by extended kin groups was inseparable from the making and remaking of medieval states. A state, as Quentin Skinner reminds us, was once linguistically cognate with estate and status, the two English words that we use today. The founding of medieval dynasties by aristocratic households, themselves in alliance with and against similar households, lent a new meaning to the old Roman notion of tribe. Tribes were now about kinship and blood, but not what moderns would call race and culture. Tribes or clans, often used interchangeably, were understood as kinship units that would combine, break apart, or recombine in different ways in their pursuit of power and privilege in society. The state as an abstract entity sitting above society in the modern Hobbesian sense made no sense because political power was so thoroughly embedded in social relations. It's not surprising that early modern encounters with the New World and with the Orient revived older usages of tribe, albeit fused with the established common sense of medieval European civilization. Early modern explorers, traders, and soldiers faced a common question. Were these new and sometimes exotic peoples that they encountered tribes? And if so, did they act similarly or different from those who were familiar from the European historical experience? In the Iberian empires following Roman precedent, the interethnic mixing that invariably emerges out of the tense and tender ties of empire was taken for granted. The problem of imperial governors was how to manage this kind of mixing and to draw boundaries between licit and illicit mixtures. At first glance, we can see that this is the moment of birth of the modern conception of race. But it is more complicated than that, because in the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the notion of hierarchically ordered castas or castes served to accommodate both ethno-racial diversity and miscegenation. Elaborate genealogical charts were made for fine-grained distinctions between a mixed-race person whose grandmother was, say, Mexican, and another whose great-grandmother was Mexican. While Native Americans may have taken on the mantle of the barbarian tribes of the Greco-Roman world, imperial society was in fact marked by altogether new racial divisions, understood in terms of the kinship of casta or caste. This was, of course, the conception of society in the Iberian empires, but also at home after the Reconquista in Spain and Portugal, where Moorish and Frankish origins were now invested with new religious and racial meanings. In places as far-flung as Goa in Western India and Peru in South America, social elites responded enthusiastically to the new logics of casta and aligned their own political ambitions with those of the imperial state builders. New languages of belonging thus came to be linked to the remaking of social hierarchies in the new and old worlds. The logic of tribes was now far more complex than ever before. It was ethnic and racial, as well as hierarchical and kin-based. The successive accretions of meaning since Roman antiquity had remade the notion of tribe in ways that were, by the year 1700, unrecognizable to someone who might have visited through space-time travel from Rome. The new European social logics of tribe and its allied notions of clan, caste, and family were opposed, at least in theory, by new Protestant conceptions of the abstract individual and an equally abstract state. The relationship between man and God came to be seen for various reasons as paramount, and as Phil Gorski has argued, this relationship had enormous consequences for reordering early modern states and societies via a disciplinary revolution. Liberalism, which is part of the title of this conference, is nothing but a byproduct of this process of social reordering, an austere back to the basics conception of man and God that maps on to the equally bare bones conception of man and the state. The radical individualism of the Reformation was constrained only by the authority now invested in the modern state. This was radical because even in its own terms, it characterized modern individuals as free from the constraints of existing social relations or kinship obligations. These constraints were understood to exist in Europe, especially in the Catholic countries, but also in the extra-European world that came into contact with armies, mercantile companies, and missionaries. Of course, these social limits to liberalism existed in England or the Netherlands too, but they were understood to be forces of tradition or reaction as opposed to modernity, which was taken to be liberal or progressive. Commerce, which unsettles older hierarchies, is the hallmark of liberalism, whereas social stability is the bulwark of what comes to be known in Anglo-American worlds as conservatism. Modernization theory, which dominated the social sciences over the past century, is merely the universalization of this Protestant bourgeois conception of the world, which is by definition opposed to older social logics of tribe and its cognates. The rebirth of the tribe in the 19th century may be seen above all as a reaction to the destabilizing abstractions of modern liberalism. In the Celtic fringe of the British Isles, as well as in what becomes Germany, modern Germany, powerful folkish conceptions emerged out of glorious tribal pasts with their own languages, cultures, and racial origins. These tribal pasts disavowed any links with Latin Europe, where the new doctrines of liberalism had taken root, first in England and the Netherlands, and then in post-revolutionary France and its conquered territories. The universal rights of man were opposed to new tribalisms now known as nations. All Germans were understood to be tied to each other by blood, kinship, race, and language. They were the descendants of Arminius, the legendary destroyer of Roman legions in the forests of northern Germany. They were not defined by the Romance languages as the Latin Europeans were. Alta Germanisch was their original language, which conditioned the social world apart from and at odds with Rome and its legacies in Western Europe. Whereas German nation building is viewed as successful, their Celtic counterparts are still works in progress in Ireland and Scotland. But the underlying principle informing these nationalisms is the same: the marriage of older notions of tribe with a modern prejudice against liberalism. It's curious then that this oddly modern notion of tribe would subsequently become globalized throughout the British Empire since the mid-19th century. In British India, Sir Henry Maine, Governor General and later chair of Historical and Comparative Law in Oxford and Cambridge, took a keen interest in evolving notions of tribe and caste. Maine saw these as kinship terms embedded everywhere in village communities in the East and West and as the basis of ancient law across Eurasia. At the heart of the Roman polity, wrote Maine, lay the tribe, which he interpreted through the prism of German historicism. To administer India, he advocated an abandonment of liberal imperialism and a turn to a new Orientalism rooted in the traditional politics of kinship and hierarchy in native society. India was then a kind of testing ground for a new Anglo-Indian conservatism influenced by German notions of the folk, and governing India according to what were seen as its ancient codes and norms became imperative. It was certainly hoped, of course, that this new conservatism could be transposed back to Britain at the earliest. But in India, a distinction was drawn between caste and tribe, the former denoting a complex hierarchical social order and the latter a simple egalitarian one. Whereas caste society in India was to be governed indirectly by collaboration with its natural leaders drawn from dominant castes, tribal society was to be ruled directly by paternalistic colonial officials with anthropological expertise on particular tribal communities. It mattered, of course, that the tribes of British India were identified in its inner and outer frontiers, where anthropological knowledge and military governance went hand in hand. Caste society was, by contrast, understood to be Indo-European or Indo-Aryan, and this heartland the heartland of this Indo-Aryan civilization was located in Upper India, defined both by race and language, Sanskrit and its daughters, and by extension to the river valleys in the south of the subcontinent. This dualistic conception of Indian society in terms of caste and tribe is undoubtedly still with us, a gift bequeathed to modern Indians by Maine and his successors. In the tribal frontiers of British India, soldiers became anthropologists as the tasks of knowing and governing became inextricably intertwined. Each tribe is associated today with its leading anthropologist administrators. For my own region of study in eastern India, Chotanagpur, the major figures of tribal anthropology in India, Dalton, Risley, Gate, left an indelible imprint. Dalton, for instance, romanticized about forest-dwelling tribes as the non-Aryan fringes of Indian civilization, placing them on par with the German and Celtic tribes that resisted the Roman Empire in Europe. He was Irish, after all. At the core of colonial governance was a paternalistic approach to tribes, described by Dalton as hill or forest communities that existed before the onset of agriculture or civilization. Paternalistic anthropologist administrators demarcated tribal districts and governed them as little kingdoms. They appointed headmen and paid them stipends to dispense local justice through new customary or informal legal arrangements. In principle, any member, or at least any male member of a tribe, could approach a colonial officer for help just as a child would approach its father. This paternalistic principle ought to be regarded as an exception to colonial liberalism, which, as John Stuart Mill wrote, excluded savages or primitive society from its purview. In other words, liberalism simply didn't apply to these groups that were understood to be tribes. And these were to be administered, what I have called elsewhere, at the ideology of primitivism. Primitivism, like liberalism, aimed for the improvement of those who were defined as savage or primitive, but it also sought to conserve or protect their community structures and traditions. For men like Dalton, the will to improve and the will to protect came together in ways that obviated the need for liberalism proper. In doing so, paternalistic tribal administrators were guided by a particular image of the tribe drawn unsurprisingly from Roman antiquity. As Ananya Kabir has recently shown, paternalistic tribal administrators and forest officials used Tacitus's Germania to explicate the workings of wild peoples and places in British India. Take the example of India's first conservator of forests, imported from what was then Prussia, Wilhelm Schlick, who drew on images of animists foraging in the forests to argue for protected forests managed by tribal communities in India. The market in particular was to be kept at bay because it would destroy these fragile communities and environments forever. This is why even today, the logic of separate tribal places remains in India, even as customary law operating as an exception to a liberal constitution continues to deny women the right to property. By the late 19th century, the conceptual baggage and technologies of tribal administration had crossed the Indian Ocean via the new routes of British imperial power. In Britain's new African possessions, the notion of tribe was adapted to the logics of native society. Chiefships were reconfigured, as were rural African communities, which were increasingly sedentarized according to new place-based logics. Indirect rule, as Mahmoud Mamdani has argued, was based on a new kind of partnership between colonial administrators and chiefs. Imperial sovereignty was at once indivisible de jure and dispersed de facto. Native authorities shaped not simply formal law, but everyday social norms and practices on the ground. The rights and obligations of men and women, young and old, insiders and outsiders. The older mobilities of ordinary people were now severely circumscribed. Culture, a word of German origin adapted admirably to Anglo-American context since the mid-19th century, became the terrain for imperial domination as much as the remaking of African societies. Peter Ecke has shown how an entirely new public was created in rural Africa by the early 20th century, parallel to the urban liberal society of white settlers. Native authorities were not, however, exceptions to liberalism. They were opposed to it altogether. It was colonial governance in the cheap, much like the British had learned from dealing with natural leaders of dominant castes, and as in India, enthusiastic collaborators always abounded. Tribe played the same role in Africa as caste did in India, as an instrument of indirect rule that entrenched a social conservatism whose virtues were lauded both by the colonial and native elites. Victorian liberalism did not cast a shadow in these tribal places, which were to be governed by the colonial state according to their own race, culture, custom. In the Gulf sheikdoms that were protectorates of the British Empire, a similar tradition of countering liberalism held sway. Governed until 1919 as an official extension of British India, flows of people, commodities, and ideas contributed to the Creole character of the Gulf as a meeting point between Arabia, the Horn of Africa, and the western coast of India. British administrators, however, preferred the tribes of the desert, whose male leadership and elders could act as bulwarks against liberal modernity, and who readily reorganized their societies in tandem with colonial law. The same administrators also appointed rulers to preside over tribes in their bickering factions. As Talal Asad has argued, the political interests of colonial anthropology ought to be inseparable from the politics of tribal societies in Arabia, despite the genuflections to Ibn Khaldun, who after all never used the word tribe or even meant what we mean by it today. Laila Abu Lughod calls the notion of tribe and its anthropology of segmentary society as theoretical metonyms used to understand the region as a whole. A distinctive model of kinship with gender and intergenerational implications comes to stand as a symbol for society across the region, necessarily at odds with the varieties of mixing that in fact characterize Gulf societies now and earlier. Race and culture come together here in a neoconservative blend that appeals to both white colonizers and regional elites. It's not uncommon to live in Qatar and hear ahistorical assertions about tribalism as if it were an enduring feature of society here. What, one may ask, made some Baluchis or Sudanese members of newly minted tribes in the Gulf? The hypermodernity of tribes in the Gulf as elsewhere is, as Miriam Cook argues, as striking as the hypermodernity of its architecture, an ongoing process of making and remaking structures of thought and practice among entire communities now designated as tribes. In conclusion, we may reflect on this cruel legacy of modern imperialism that bifurcates the world into an imaginary West that is considered to be the proper home of liberalism, and a putative non-West that is regarded as simply as incapable of liberalism. This legacy of illiberalism that survives, as well as springs forth around us in the Indian Ocean world in different ways all the time, is of course a globalized hybrid that shifts across time and space. But as post-colonial scholarship in the wake of Edward Said's Orientalism has shown, producing and maintaining these boundaries between the West and the non-West, and by extension between modern liberalism and what is not so, have been key modalities of imperial power and its many post-imperial afterlives. Across the Indian Ocean Rim, the tribe and its cognates has produced new social conservatisms that reinforce and sustain the bifurcation of the world into liberalism and its illiberal other. Power and knowledge continue to interpenetrate each other in ways that actively generate new social realities based on curiously modern conceptions of non-Western traditions that are nonetheless labeled as traditional or timeless. In this paper, I've merely skimmed the surface of the subject by sketching the political and intellectual genealogies of the kinds of illiberal politics that underlay how tribes sprung up across the British Empire by the late 19th century, and that renew themselves with astonishing tenacity into the present. And I invite you to think along with me as I delve further into this subject. Thank you.
Uday. Thank you very much, Uday. Now we have Islam.
Thank you, Uday. I think that our papers fall perfectly after each other. So today I talk about the ruling family and national identity in Qatar. In my paper, I argue that the Qatari ruling family proactively continues to consolidate its own position within Qatari society some 165 years after first coming to power, by adopting a social conservativist approach that maintains and further stimulates the social hierarchy and the inclusion-exclusion schemes. In other words, the official historical narrative on the composition and evolution of Qatari society is an imaginaire that contributes to the reproduction of the current social inclusion and exclusion schemes. This historical narrative emphasizes three main issues. First, the role of Arab tribes in the inhabitation process, the evolution of governing authority, and the creation of statehood in Qatar, while disregarding major factions of the society, particularly those of Abid, Hawala, and Persian backgrounds. By Abid, I mean people of slave backgrounds, and Hawala were Arab tribes that migrated to Persia and then migrated back to Arabia. The Qatari state adopts three primary means to reproduce and stimulate the existing inclusion and exclusion schemes. First, it promotes the dominant Arab social values, culture, traditions, and customs that perpetuate a scheme of inclusion and exclusion and secure the position of the ruling family and its Arab tribal allies at the apex of social hierarchy. Second, it has been narrowing down the definition of what constitutes a Qatari, insofar as national identity is concerned. Third, through articles of the Constitution, the legal system, and implicit family policies related to marriage and nationality, the state has been directly and indirectly influencing individuals' marriage choices. This, in return, influences Qataris' perceptions of social hierarchy. Qatar, as other countries of the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, bears a legacy of pronounced ethnical and linguistic richness and a depth of cultural melange. The patterns of movements and waves of migrants from Saudi Arabia to Qatar by tribes escaping from drought and famine in the fourth quarter of the 17th century, and similar waves and patterns, but on a smaller scale, from Persia and Africa, contributed to the creation and evolution of the Qatari social structure. Qatar hosted these multiple populations with distinctive identities, which were highly mobile across Qatar, the Arabian Peninsula, and the shores of the Persian Gulf, under its loose administrative body that existed at the time. By 1907, the settled population in Qatar was made up of 27,000 mainly tribal and nomadic individuals, consisting of 25 major clans, largely concentrated in Doha and Wakra, in addition to Abid and Persians, who counted up to 23% of the population and continued to increase in size over the following decades. Although all the inhabitants were not indigenous and arrived to Qatar by similar means but from different trajectories, Arab tribes claimed to be the main settlers, and Abid and Persians were considered as foreigners. Germane to this discussion, one has to know that the Qatari society is extremely stratified. Max Weber's complex stratification model perfectly elucidates the hierarchical system in Qatari society, which is not exclusively stratified based on an individual's relationship to modes of production, as Karl Marx suggests, but on the interplay of three stratification systems. These systems are a caste system based on ethnicity, race, religious sect, purity of Arab blood, and tribal lineage that impacts an individual's position in Qatari social hierarchy. A class system that is determined by economic wealth, and a party system based on the relationship of an individual's tribe to the ruling family. The interplay of these three stratification systems inevitably places the ruling family at the apex of the social pyramid, followed by loyal Arab Sunni tribes. And then other tribes and families follow, depending on their ethnicity, race, religious sect, purity of Arab blood, tribal lineage, economic wealth, and allegiance to the ruling family. The state has closely merged the social and political hierarchies in Qatari society, in the sense that the social class determines one's position in the political hierarchy, and vice versa. This narrative enticed Arab tribes to rally around and concede allegiance to a Thani tribe to maintain their position in the social hierarchy and the political hierarchy as well. Insofar as the state's narrative on national identity is concerned, I use Anthony Smith's definition of national identity. Smith defines national identity as the collective unity among members of a single community based on 5 main fundamental features: an historic territory or homeland, common myth and historical memories, a common mass public culture, common legal rights and duties, and a common economy with territorial mobility for its members. Qatar recognizes the right to Qatari citizenship for individuals whose fathers resided in Qatar prior to 1930. Yet, one has to make a distinction here between a citizen and a national. A citizen is an individual who enjoys the political, social, and economic rights outlined in the Constitution and laws of the state, while a national is not only a citizen of the state, but an individual that carries the dominant characteristics of the nation. Therefore, a Qatari of Persian or Abid origins, or a naturalized citizen, may enjoy equal political, social, and economic rights, but is not necessarily socially perceived as a representative of the Qatari national identity. Insofar as historic territory, common myth, and historical memories are concerned, the Qatari state reinforces the Arab and tribal identities of the state through the Qatari official historical narrative, constitution, and official symbols. The Qatari state's historical narrative is ostensibly biased in favor of Arab tribes. It emphasizes the inhabitation process and patterns of movement of Arab tribes to Qatar, without narrating those of Abid, Ajam, and Huwala. This is very important, as data show that out of the 27,000 inhabitants in 1907, slaves and freed slaves counted up to 18.5% of the population, and Huwala counted up to 7.4%, in addition to Persians who inhabited the region. Since the discovery of oil, the state has reproduced Arabic culture by ensuring tribal and ethnic domination that is in harmony with the oil-based economy and circulation of wealth. Thus, through fostering and enforcing a dominant cultural structure and controlling the material structure of the state, Arab tribal social actors have dominated other social actors in the political field. Political institutions capitalize on these structures, as the tribe became the prime determinant of an individual's inclusion as a national of the state. This has helped in reproducing the tribal identity and dominant culture that continue to manifest in the lifestyle of Qataris. With regards to common mass public culture, the Constitution of the State of Qatar recognizes Islam as the official religion of the state, Sharia law as the main source of legislation, and Arabic as the official language of the state. One should also consider the version of Islam that the state sponsors, as the state has been a promoter of Wahhabism. This can be seen through naming the state mosque after Imam Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. This clearly shows the state's sponsorship of the Wahhabi religious school. The state's rhetoric does not really reflect Qatari's religious beliefs, but rather it's how the state narrates these beliefs in order to exclude sections of the society who follow other religious schools or sects. By sponsoring such narratives, the state influences individual social status and maintains a static social order, as conversion is unlikely. And in case it happens, other factors such as ethnic identity will limit any movement along the social class spectrum. Tribal identity is also reinforced by the state as an integral part of the Qatari national identity. For example, the state changed the National Day in 2007 from September 3rd, which celebrated Qatar's independence from the British Empire, to December 18th to commemorate the unity of Qatari Arab tribes by Sheikh Jassim bin Muhammad Al Thani in 1878. This day is celebrated by Arab tribes, reinforcing their allegiance to the Al Thani tribe. One can also see how in 2006, Al-Suq al-Farsi, or the Persian souk, was renamed, was redone in traditional Arabian style and renamed Suwa'if, or Suq Waqif, as an attempt by the state to replace any symbol of Persian culture and replace it with an Arab Khaliji culture. A consultant to the Qatar Museum Authority claims that higher authorities have asked to remove events that involved Persians, whether domestically or regionally, from any timeline of Qatari history. With regards to Abid, there has been also a systematic exclusion from the official national identity narrative. This is clear in the narration in Bin Jalmoud House, one of Musharraf Museum's heritage houses, that denies that Abid heritage blended into Qatari culture, while a video shown in Mohammed bin Jassim House, another museum in the same Musharraf's complex, shows the total opposite. The difference in people's lived memories and the official historical narrative of the state reflects an attempt by the state to present a censored history, which satisfies a contemporary agenda by eradicating the Persian and Abid contributions to Qatari history and culture. It's worth mentioning that the integration of Abid to Qatari society post-abolishment of slavery is absent in the Bin Jalmoud House narrative, disregarding a faction of Qatari society that carries a slavery heritage. This faction is present in almost all tribes who granted their tribal name to their slaves after abolishments, and families that were created as a unity of unrelated slaves. The neglect of slaves' integration into Qatari society serves the contemporary agenda of the state in two distinct ways. First, it does not contest claims of purity of Arab blood by Arab tribes. Second, it encourages a culture of neglect of slavery heritage among Qataris of slave backgrounds, who buy into this culture not to disparage their status in society. In regards to other fundamental features of national identity, which Smith discusses, such as common legal rights and duties for all members and common economy with territorial mobility for members, the state grants equal legal rights to Qatari citizens regardless of their backgrounds. The state in Qatar, dominated by Al Thani tribe, has legitimized itself by highlighting and showing how Al Thani, along with a number of other tribes that share the same fundamental features, fit into the Qatari national identity narrative. The state emphasizes the Arab origins of Al Thani tribe in its official publications, in addition to describing Sheikh Jassim bin Muhammad Al Thani as the founder of Qatar, and asserting that the people of Qatar perceived him as an imam. This discourse is promoted by the state in an attempt to show how the ruling family shares the same historic territory, common myth, historical memories, and mass public culture of Qatar. With regards to family policies and legal system, through regulating the marriage institution, the Qatari state indirectly influences the shape and formation of the family institution. Laws like guardianship and kafa'a, which I'll be happy to discuss further in the Q&As, serve this state agenda. With regards to citizenship laws, in 1961, the state of Qatar issued Law Decree No. 2, which regulated the Qatari nationality. This law was repealed, yet there's an article that deserves further in-depth examination. Article 12 of that law stated that a Qatari woman who is married to a foreigner may acquire her husband's nationality if the law of her husband's country permits. Otherwise, she may retain her Qatari nationality for 1 year following the date of the marriage contract. This article gives the state the right to denaturalize a Qatari woman if she marries a foreign national after 1 year of the marriage. This is a critical article which shows how the state established barriers to prevent Qatari females from marrying non-Qataris. Although this law might have been put in place for issues concerned with nationality, rights in general, or for demographic reasons, one should not disregard the social impact of this article, even if it was repealed later. Questioning a Qatari female's citizenship for marrying a non-Qatari might influence Qatari's perception of her social status, given that mixed marriage will contest the purity of her offspring's Arab blood. In conclusion, instead of homogenizing Qatari identity to include Qataris of different backgrounds, the state of Qatar sponsors a historical narrative on the composition and evolution of Qatari society that emphasizes the role of Arab tribes in the inhabitation process, the evolution of governing authority, and the creation of statehood in Qatar. This official historical narrative disregards a major faction of the society, particularly those of Abid, Huwala, and Persian backgrounds, that played an important role in the economy of Qatar pre-oil discovery and engaged in a social struggle with the Arab tribal social actors of the state. It's clear that the state-sponsored historical narrative does not reflect people's lived memories. These lived realities manifest a melange culture with distinguished Arab, Persian, Abid, and Huwala diversity that existed for over a century of Qatar's short history. Whether the state's imaginary will eclipse people's lived reality or not is something only time will unfold. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I invite you all to join us for a cup of coffee and to continue your conversation with these excellent panelists. Please join me in thanking them and you for an excellent panel.